Okay, session about the redemptive gifts of cities, towns, and even nations. I have to say clearly, this is all the teaching material of Arthur Burk from America, Plumline Ministries. I'm working with this information quite a lot, but the whole revelation and teaching just comes from him. So this is not my material, it's just material I'm working with, but it is material that is very helpful to get us focused in not spending time on things that are not important. We want to get to the root of the issues, not the fruit of that's in our towns and cities. And this is very helpful for us as intercessors within a city or town context, to look at our town and to get a strategy. How do we approach our town? How do we understand our town? And what do we focus on to bring that town to the manifestation of the kingdom of God? Okay, so we're going to go through that very systematically. What's important for us to see is that in the last few years, I would say probably since we've had the transformation videos in 2000, there's been a shift in the church in acknowledging that everything in the Bible is not just about individuals. And that when we read Scripture, we find that 50 to 75% of Scripture was written about groups, for nations, for people groups, and so forth. And I think for us in our Western setting, where everything is about individuality, we've really missed the boat. And as I said the other day, God's not schizophrenic. The principles are applicable to the corporate unit as it is to the individual. And so as we look at cities and towns, we're looking at units. They're just a bit bigger in scale, but we still want to understand that unit in the same manner that we would understand an individual. Now, this teaching that I'll be doing now is based on and founded on a teaching that Arthur Burk does on the redemptive gift of individuals, the 7 gifts in Romans 12. Okay, so there's a lot of things I can't explain to you now, which comes from that level. If you go into the bookshop right next door, you'll see that most of these materials are available to buy. And the series about the redemptive gifts of cities and towns, you will also find there. I've just extracted all the principles, while in the CD series, he looks at certain cities in America to show you how the redemptive gift was found within that city. So we work from the premises of Romans 12, on the redemptive gift teachings that Arthur does, which is a remarkable revelation on the gifts that God has given, not based on psychology, but based on revelation in Scripture, which I find wonderful. And the first time I was exposed to it was in 2001, and I've been working with this material since then, and I've been astounded at how accurate it is. I'm not somebody that accepts a new thing very quickly. And so I take time, I look at it. And the first time we went to France with teams with specifically this material on the cities and the gifts of cities, I thought, I don't know whether this is going to work. Let's go and have a look. And as we visited towns and cities, we'll try to gauge. And I was flabbergasted at how accurate this information is. So the process of how they got to this, I can't explain to you now. But please trust me if I say it is something that we can really use. Okay? Time and time again, we see in Scripture that God judged entire nations, even though there were righteous individuals within that nation. And I think this is important for us as a church and Christians to acknowledge. You can be the most wonderful child of God, and God judges your city. And the problem for us as believers are that most of us love our holy huddle on Sundays and whenever we come together as Christians, and we're really not bothered about the world out there because I'm saved, I've got the true Lord, I'm not a Muslim. Those Muslims, they don't have the truth. And we get very judgmental and very prideful. But what we forget is that when our city stands in sin, or our people group, we will suffer. Because God looks not just to you as an individual and where you stand, but He looks in the corporate units. And that has to activate us into a position of responsibility. Because I'm staying in this city. Now, I'm glad if I've got a relationship with God and He's blessing me because of that, but I don't want some trouble because my city is not in the right place. Okay, and we need to start taking responsibility for that stewardship, acknowledging that poor little Daniel, as righteous as he was, suffered because of his own people's sin. He was taken to Babylon out of his own country, not because of his sin, but because of his people's sins. And we need to get activated. If God has placed you in a town or a city, you're there for a purpose. If you're not doing something to pray for that place, you're missing it, I believe. Okay, in the New Testament, there are major portions that were written to the collective church or to cities. We remember that if you look at the letters of Revelations, it was written to the church in a city. And that city was very important and was addressed. God addressed big groups of people. Okay, so if we go to Acts 17, and Elizabeth just went to that scripture yesterday, it says about the creation of nations and so forth, it says, and he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth. And he, God, has determined their pre-appointed times and their boundaries of their dwellings so that they should seek the Lord, in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. So firstly, we need to acknowledge that if we find a nation, a people group, a city, a town, we have to acknowledge the reason why that place exists is because God intended it so. God determined that. I love what Arthur says. He always says, God was there first. And we get so entangled with what the devil is doing that we forget God's in control. God was there from the beginning. God was the first one that moved. God has always been involved in the process. We need to get back onto his page, and we need to start looking at things from his perspective, not from our fearful perspective where we don't have faith. So the first thing is God made all people groups. He says he made it from one blood. Okay, so the whole thing of racism and we better than somebody else is obviously a lie. So from one man, God created every city and ethnic group. God crafted every city and nation intentionally. There's a reason why your town exists. And that reason is because God had a purpose for it. Okay? Next, God's intent is that the entire earth be populated, because it says here that every nation he created all nations from the same blood to dwell on all the face of the earth. That's an interesting reference. God's purpose was from the beginning when he spoke to Adam. He says, fill the earth. Why? Because man is God's tool to bring forth the redemption that he has placed within the DNA of every piece of ground. Man is the instrument that will bring that forth. And he has determined, and he says God's intent is that the entire earth be populated. We said that already. And on the land, the redemptive gift can be released and empowered. Okay, if we have a piece of land that don't have people on it, the gift and the calling of that piece of land cannot be brought forth. God determined the time set for people groups, when they will be born and when they will die. God determined the exact places where people groups shall live, the boundaries. And God designed these redemptive gifts for a purpose. What's the purpose according to Acts 17? So that they should seek the Lord. That means you're in my town. Each of those towns has a gift. Have a gift. What's my tenses? And that gift is there for no other purpose than helping people to get to know God. And my purpose as an intercessor is to get my city to bring forth that gift. To contribute to the kingdom of God, because obviously nobody has all the revelation, but everyone has something of God, and when we bring it together, there's the fullness of his kingdom. And your town, your city has a responsibility, a gift that was given to it from its origins, that was supposed to be presented to the world so that God could be made known to the world through that unique gift. Every city, every nation has one of the 7 redemptive gifts of Romans 12. Now, again, you have to work with this material to really trust the material. But if you listen to the redemptive gifts of the individual teaching, you'll see that Arthur says we all have one gift. We might have a lot of flavorings on our gift, but we have one specific DNA. I call it your substructure, your wiring system that God has given you. And so we see that every town, city, and nation has one of these 7 redemptive gifts. And there's an immense variety within the gifts. Okay, so that does not make you the same than another town or city or another person, but there's a specific DNA, a specific purpose that's connected to that gift. Now, as we would do with redemptive gifts of individuals, we look at characteristics of a person to try and figure out what of one of the 7 gifts they are, because every gift has a certain manifestation. You know, we look at people, we think them strange. We look at Gerda, and we sometimes think she's quite strange, but you know, she's the way she is because God made her so. There's a DNA that God has put within her substructure that is manifesting. Now, the same is true when we look at a city, town, nation, people group, is that God's not schizophrenic. The principles that apply to individuals, He applies to the corporate unit. There's a spirit DNA coming from God, having God's ability that He has placed within, and we need to discover that. And the best way to start discovering it is by looking at the external characteristics. Okay, Arthur always says if you've got a bag full of animals, you put your hand in the bag, you take something out, you say, well, this is a funny animal. It's got 2 orange feet, webbed feet, orange beak. It's white. It's got 2 wings and it says, quack. What is it? It's a duck. How do I know it's a duck? I'm not a veterinarian. Well, you don't have to be, because certain external characteristics give me an indication of what type of animal I'm working with, and the fact that it's different to a 4-legged animal or any other type of animal. And so when we look at our cities and we look at what do they manifest, they can help us to understand what the gift, the spiritual thing is that God placed there. And this is very important. Remember, we need to get away from our Western thinking. Our Western thinking says, I will believe if I see it. But the problem is nothing, Scripture says, exists in the physical except that which was produced by the spiritual. Nothing can manifest except there was an invisible influence that first brought it forth. God says everything was created by the invisible Word of God. So if something is visible, I need to ask myself, what is the spiritual, invisible thing that has produced it? Now, obviously, we have cities and towns that don't necessarily serve God. So that God DNA that sits within that community will manifest, but obviously not in the pure way that God wanted, because sin will pervert it. Sin will cause it to have certain things that's not biblical. But that still helps us to understand what that DNA is. Okay? Then, once we've determined the gift of the city by looking at the external behavioral characteristics, we can then go to Scripture and find information on what the spiritual DNA is that God has given that gift, given that city, what His purpose was with that gift, and what that gift should supply to the world about the knowledge of God. Okay? Now, within the gifts, there's an immense latitude for the superficial variations of culture. But even though there's a great diversity, still the diversity is always contained within certain boundaries. I always tell people, you know, if I say the word dog, and if each one of you had a TV screen on top of your head, I promise you I would not see the same picture, because there's such a variety of dogs. And yet there's something that helps us to determine that they are all part of the same group. You can get a dog that is as big as a rat. You can get a dog that is as big as a horse nearly. But there's certain things that still help us to determine that. And so though there's a lot of variation, there's still certain things that will help us to determine it. Now within the parameters, there is room for the culture to make a superficial and visible difference on the surface, but the root issues are the same. Now, if you identify the redemptive gift of a city, you immediately know what the central demonic stronghold of that city is. And this is why this is such an amazing revelation. Because, you know, for us, it's been involved in spiritual mapping and research, and I must personally say I don't really like it a lot. It's not something I want to do much. I many times feel that within the body of Christ, our focus on research pulls us away from the thing that we're supposed to do, namely pray. If research is taking your time, that you should have used for prayer, leave it. You're wasting your time. But if in the prayer process I can use a different story. But the fact is, with mapping, and I don't know who of you have ever done a mapping exercise a few years ago when we had this type of color dot for this type of thing in the city, that type of symbol for this. You sit with this map and you've got 1,000 dots in front of you and you say, where do I start? What must I pray about? I can't pray about 1,000 things in my town. That's not giving me a focus. And as we shared, there's root issues and fruit issues. So how do I know which of them are root issues and which of them are fruit issues so I can be focused on the more important things? Now, when you understand the redemptive gift of your city or town, you immediately know what the stronghold is. You immediately can come to understanding what the root foundational issues are that need to be addressed. And that's an amazing tool. Why do I say that? Well, it's very simple. There's only one thing that threatens Satan. His name is God. There's only one thing that he's scared of, and that's the God thing in every people group. So, very simply put, God has created every people group and he's put a gift into that people group, and that gift is the biggest threat to the kingdom of darkness. And so for the enemy to be successful, it's very simple. He needs to attack that thing. And so your stronghold will always be a stronghold that tries to eliminate the God factor. A simple principle. So if I can understand what the God gift is, I immediately know what the thing is that Satan needs to try and pervert in order for that gift to not be successful in being an instrument in God's hands. So that's a very wonderful tool. There is a central sin in every community that's the exact perversion of the redemptive gift. We must significantly downplay the demonic presence and focus on the human responsibility to deal with the sin issue. Again, the fact that we have demons, that's not our issue. We know they have an effect, but they are there for a reason. They're only there as a byproduct of another problem. Okay, and the problem is sin. The problem is what we humans do to give those demonic spirits a place to function in. Okay, so we must really be careful to be so focused on wanting to know what the demon's name is and what rank he has and how strong he is. So what? What's the difference? The fact is he's there because we have made space for him. Remember, Satan didn't have any authority. Remember, Satan was stripped of all authority. He only has the authority that we give him. Because God is the source of his authority, and I promise you, God didn't give Satan any authority over us. He gave authority to man, but man gave his authority to Satan. Okay, so our focus is really to look at the sin issues within that community that's connected to the redemptive gift so that the demonic can be dealt with on a later stage. So there is a central sin in every community. That sin is the exact perversion of the redemptive gift. Okay, and that's very important. If you think of Freedom Park, I was thinking about it after I did the lecture, that God told us we must pray for that hill to be a place where his presence can be. We must call it the hill of the Lord, a place where God will be purely worshipped so that his presence can dwell there. What's the enemy doing? The exact opposite. He's creating that place to be a place for the presence of demons, where there's worship to demonic entities, which is the exact perversion of the very thing that God said we must pray in over that hill. So that's exactly the same principle. Now, if we go to Scripture and we look at scriptures like Amos 1 and 2, it's very interesting to see that God makes use of reductionism. He takes all of the sins of a nation and reduces it to a handful of root sins. And he says, that's the problem. Let me just read, if you can turn to Amos. Let's just see. It starts in Amos now. It addresses many nations, but for instance, if we look at Amos 1, it speaks to Damascus. He says in verse 3 of Amos 1, "Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Damascus, and for 4 I will not reverse the punishment of it, or revoke my word concerning it, because they have done the following." So God says, listen, there's 4 sins in your community. If you don't address those 4 things, my wrath and judgment will not be removed. Now, if you think about communities, every community has all the sins. You know that. Doesn't matter where you go in the world, you'll get all the sins everywhere. So the issue is not just the fact that there's sin. The issue is there's specific sins that offend God immensely. And it differs from town to town, city to city, nation to nation, what God has an issue with. Which just makes sense. Why? Because if God gifts you with something, I mean, if I'm clever and I don't use my intelligence, I'm offending God. If I'm not very intelligent and I'm doing foolish things, well, you know, I don't have such a big responsibility in comparison with a guy that has the ability. So when God gifts you with a certain gift and you miss it on that point, on that very strength that God has given you, you are using your strength for that which is wrong, that becomes a very great offense. Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay. So it is fascinating to look at the specific iniquities that God focused on and to see which of them is conspicuous by its omission. Particularly the fact that in none of the Gentile nations in Amos 1 or 2 does God identify idolatry as a reason for their destruction. And each one of those nations had immense idolatry. God doesn't even mention it. He doesn't even say that's the issue that he has with him. So what God is basically saying is that idolatry in those nations were not root issues. It was fruit. God's worried about the root that's producing all the other sins. If you look at Judah, when God speaks to Judah in Amos 2, from verse 4, God addresses the fact that they are busy with idolatry. But for the idolatrous nations, he's quiet about it. So it seems that the worship of the idols of other nations in Judah, God says that's a root issue, you need to deal with it. In Moab, for instance, where they worship Chemosh, we must understand that it seems that this was a fruit sin, not a root sin. And God doesn't address, when he speaks to Moab, the issue of idolatry. So this helps us to see in Scripture that there are more grievous sins that bring forth God's wrath and less grievous sins. But those sins are not connected to what the sin is. They are connected to what God has given that community as a spiritual gift and the fact that they are perverting that very God thing that should be bringing forth life. Essentially, in every community, we have every sin. Okay? In some places, there are more than others, but the intensity and prevalence of sin is not the issue. The issue is that in the eyes of God, when a community perverts their strength and turns it into iniquity, when they take their redemptive gift and reverse it, that offends God to the utmost. And these root iniquities then empower the stronghold that establishes itself in that community. I think this is a wonderful tool. Not so easy necessarily to implement, but to get the principle will really help us. Now there's a second tool that God gives us in Scripture, and that's whenever he gave prophetic words over communities. For instance, if we look at the prophetic word in Ezekiel 16:49 that God gives over Sodom. Now, if you think of Sodom, tell me what's Sodom's biggest sin? Just a bit louder? Okay, well, that's what we would think. They were perverts, real homosexuals, so that's their sin. You know, when God addresses them through the prophetic word, he doesn't even mention it. You know what he mentions? He mentions 4 things. He says, I have a problem with you because of your pride. your ease and idleness, and the fact that you do not look after the poor and the needy. Lord, you forgot something. What about the homosexuality? That prophet didn't hear from God. Well, God was addressing the foundational iniquity. Basically, the homosexuality and the perversion came from a root that he addressed in the prophecy. So when we look at prophetic words that God gave to specific communities, especially if we know what that community's redemptive gift was, we get a lot of insight and revelation about what the issue is and what the call is that God has for that type of gift. Okay. So our spiritual mapping becomes, our spiritual mapping strategies become more precise. Dots and map on the map that confused can now be ignored, and we can now go to 3 or 4 root sins. Though they are the most difficult to deal with, we will get infinitely more return on our effort and time if we deal with those issues. Now, we as intercessors need to get to this point where we say, listen, we can do easy things, chop off some fruit and get a quick result. Or we can say, listen, let's use the time and the effort that we have. Let's embrace a little bit of pain. Let's, get some perseverance and endurance going. And let's say, this issue that's the most difficult, the root issue, let's start dealing with this. Let's take responsibility and ask God to speak to us about how we're going to deal with this thing. The next question is, how do we deal with demonic strongholds and the iniquity that empower them? Okay, firstly, we just want to mention, and this is important, I'll also mention it in my next lecture, is the fact that we need to get an understanding of how authority works. Okay, because without authority, you can't deal with the enemy. And there are different types of authority, and again, this is a teaching within a teaching, so I don't have the time to explain it to you. But in Scripture, or in our exercise of authority as New Testament believers, there's 4 categories of authority that we clearly see. Firstly, governmental authority, so that's connected to your leadership position. As the head of my house, I have authority. I don't need to work for authority to have authority over my household. God has instituted me as the head of the house. Okay, so it's about learning to exercise that authority in order for me to get the results. But if the devil is running around in my home, it's because I'm not exercising my authority. Okay? And I need to know how to exercise that. The second type of authority is what we call positional authority. And our positional authority is where Scripture says we are seated with Christ in heavenly places above all powers, principalities, demons, whatever. Now you know that is not a blank check statement. That's not referring to, I have authority over the Queen of Heaven because I'm seated with Christ in heavenly places above all powers. Because you won't be able to do that. Because you can't deal with the Queen of Heaven with positional authority. Positional authority is that everything that is my stewardship, I have full authority over. If I own it, paid for it, rent it, there's different categories. I have full authority. I don't have to go and work for it, develop it, plead for it. I already have it. That's why my household, what I own, my children, whatever, those things, I can keep the devil out and any demon out of that territory because I have authority concerning those things. Okay, then thirdly, we have special anointings or what we call imparted authority. Those would be special authorities that God dishes out and He just does it the way He wants to, and we don't understand why some people have it and some don't. Some people just have authority over praying about the weather patterns or funny things like that. It's just something that oozes out of them and they didn't work for it. God gave it to them. It's a special unction. But the most important form of authority that we all need to develop, especially as intercessors, and this is the authority we will have to stand on in order to deal with demonic presence, for instance, in our town, is authority that's rooted in virtue. Basically, in order for you to have authority, in order for you to deal with a certain negative aspect, a certain vice, you need to develop the opposite virtue that can cancel out that vice. Ephesians 4:28 is an interesting story. Paul says, let him who steals, steal no more, but let him go and work, so that he can have money, so that he can give to others. Okay, Paul, what you're trying to say? Well, very simply, somebody that steals, that's a vice, that's sin. That's wrong, it's unrighteousness. He says that person needs to move to a place where he doesn't do the sin anymore. Steal no more. There you get to 0. Then he says, but that's not good enough. You have to develop further. Now you must go and work so you can have an income. He says that's not enough. You have to move further to a place where once you have money, you give it away. And that's the opposite of stealing. So that person has developed authority from a position of stealing, iniquity, sin. They've developed authority, not just, we're not holy because we stop sinning. Righteousness is not neutral. Righteousness is a positive position where you have moved into positive numbers, learning to do righteousness, not just to not do unrighteousness. And so that person has moved into the virtue that is the opposite of the vice. That person has authority. You think of drug addicts that start ministries. They've come through that whole bondage process. They've come into deliverance. They've come into liberty. And when that person ministers to other drug addicts, there's authority. Why? Because he conquered that very thing. He's moved into a place of virtue that's the opposite of the vice that he used to do. There's authority released. And the same is true when we look at our communities and we see certain strongholds and certain iniquities that empower those strongholds. As intercessors, we will not be able to see success in our intercession if we've not developed that authority in our own lives. It's not a blank check. The name of Jesus is not a magic wand. The fact that I used his name does not mean I have authority, because I have to be a righteous man for the righteousness of Christ to flow through me. And so when we look, for instance, at immorality in a community, and if that's a root sin and you want to go and pray against immorality needs to be conquered in your own life. You need to develop the virtue as an intercessor, and I think we need to get more intentional to start developing those processes in our intercessory groups, so that when we go to pray about a thing, there's authority that's released, and it's not just some nice prayers because we're very religious. So after finding the root sin, the intercessors must develop the virtues that is the opposite of the vice that needs to be prayed about. Okay? The next thing that we just quickly want to look at is that every town, every city has what we call a catalytic institution. Your question is, what institution did God use to birth this community? Because that's the instrument that God has chosen to be the life giver. And what they have found is that when you go into communities and you invest your effort into the catalytic institution, your results are disproportionately better. Meaning, if your city was started because of a governmental institution, government, you can pray for the church, you can pray for business, you can pray for families and whatever, but you won't have the same results as when you pray for the catalytic institution, because it seems that God releases life back into communities through the catalytic institution. So if you want to see every facet of that community have new life, it must be because the catalytic institution was impacted by the kingdom of God. So that's also going to help you to focus in your community, in your city, in your town, to say, okay, we can pray for many things, many institutions, but which one would be the catalytic institution so we can address these root foundational issues within the catalytic institution so that God can release life to every facet of that community. Do you understand the principle? Okay, we're going to break here. In towns, what we're going to look at now is the process that Arthur gave to help us to try and identify the gift firstly, and then once we've identified the things we need to be aware of that we need to work with. So I'm just going to go through the 7 steps, I think it's 7 steps that he gives. In that, we're going to look at the characteristics that help us to identify each one of the 7 gifts. So it's a lot of information. The characteristics that I will be giving you, you must understand that this teaching really has so many layers of revelation and things that God can still reveal about each gift. It's really in an embryonic phase, Arthur says, in Revelation. So when we look at the characteristics, I'm only going to give you a few that tends to be visible in each one of the gifts. But please know it's more complex than just those few little things. Those are just some of the markers, some of the indicators that help us to discern it. Now, we are looking for a package. I always try to explain this to people when we do the gifts of individuals. The fact that a characteristic is present by no means tells you that that's the gift of the city. I'm looking for a package deal. I'm looking for a gift that has the dominant, or the, say, 80% of what we say that gift normally would manifest. We're looking for a package. Okay, so when you're going to go back to your town or city, you're trying to use this information, it's very important that you understand you're looking for the majority of things to be there, not just 1 or 2 things. And there's still a lot of things that can mislead you, because we need the discernment of the Holy Spirit to know what the root issues are, to see things the way, not the way they appear to us, but to understand why they are present in a certain community. What is interesting, if we're looking at a mapping exercise, is that when we look at a map of a city, it already can give us some information about the gift, which is quite fascinating. Okay, so the first step in identifying the redemptive gift is to look at the history and the demographics of that city or town or even any other entity, but we're looking at cities now. And obviously, as I shared when we spoke about roots and foundations, you go back to the beginning. How did it start? Because the way it started will always give you a clue. Now, when we look at the beginning or the founding, sometimes it will be a person that founded or started a place. And what they have found is that many times, if you can identify the gift of the founder, that city or town, many times have the same gift. Most of the time. Obviously, there's always exceptions. God's unique in the way He works. But the question we're asking is, why was this place founded? What was its vision, its purpose? What was the motive? What were the motives in the fact that it was founded? And why is it here and not 10 kilometers down the line? Why did God put it here? I can't go into the details of that, but for instance, what they have found is that many times people groups with a certain gift will be attracted to land that has the same gift. Not always, but many times, because there's a resonance. They fit easily. For instance, South Africa has the redemptive gift of giving. And it was the givers, the Dutch, that came and settled here first. When the Portuguese came by, they didn't come and stay. They just went by. Why was it the Dutch that came here and not the Portuguese or any one of the other nations that went around the Cape? And they believe it's because of that resonance of gift, where the land has a certain gift and the people have a gift that fits. That's the same gift, and obviously they've got the best ability to bring that gift forth from the land. Okay? If we look at the second step, so your first step, and that's not a small step, to look at the history of your town or your city and to get it condensed into understandable characteristics, takes a lot of time and effort. The next thing that you will do is you will start looking at the geography of the city, looking at a map, looking at the way the city is laid out. And this is the steps they go through, because there's some things in geography that's very pertinent for certain of the gifts. And if you see it right at the beginning, you already have some indicators that might be the gift. Firstly, if you look at the geography, you want to see if the city has 2 clear demarcations, 2 parts. Meaning, is there something dividing the city in 2 clear parts that are very different to one another? Now, in many cities, you will find a river doing that or whatever. If we think, for instance, of Pretoria, the west and the east are 2 totally different parts in everybody's understanding. And that's normally an indication that that city has the redemptive gift of teaching. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean the other gifts can't have that separation, but it's a very strong indicator of most Redemptive Gifts teacher cities. Next, you go to your phone book or even to a map and you go and look at the churches. Look at how many churches, different churches. Is there a lot of churches in that town, a lot of differentiation in churches or not? Because what we have found is that there's a high percentage of churches both in the teacher and giver city. Because both those gifts tend to have a religious spirit. Okay? In the teacher cities, you will have older streams of denominations, the more historically well-known type of denominations, because if you understand the teacher gift, they always see that which is old as more legitimate than that which is new. And if it's a giver community, many times you will see many streams of denominations, but they will be mostly modern streams and independent churches. Again, if you take this characteristic to the fact that South Africa is a giver nation, and if you just look at our nation, we really have a lot of churches. If you look at Pretoria, that has a redemptive gift of teaching, it's a city with a lot of churches. There's a lot of choice, many places you can go to. So that might be an indication of those two gifts. Then, next you go and look at the businesses in that town. And say, no, I skipped something. Did I? Firstly, I skipped a lot. Okay. Firstly, next, it's not on the PowerPoint. We go to look at the medical industry within that town or city. What does the health sector look like? Is there a disproportionate presence of medical institutions, disproportionate to the population that's staying there? Because that can also be an indicator of a teacher city, because a teaching city has a lot to do with health issues. And again, if you think of Pretoria, it's astounding at how many different type of medical institutions we have in the city, disproportionate to what other cities have. Then you go and look at education. All the educational institutions within that town or city. Now, if the education permeates just about every institution, meaning you've got very strong, varied institutions of education on every level of society, from kindergarten to up to university, schools, little schools where you can learn to do hair or nails or what, just a lot of educational institutions for every facet that you can think of. That is mostly a sign that it is a teacher city. If you find schooling that's primarily universities or higher education, especially vested into technology, that might be an indication of a prophet community. So you look at your education, you look at what type of education, because that will tell you something about the gift that God has placed within the DNA of that community. And third, we will look at the businesses. Businesses can be a significant indicator of a gift. Not just the number of businesses, but the type of businesses that are present. And here we must be very careful to reason to the root. Okay, then this is where we need to become accustomed to using this new set of tools. If you look at this teaching just as some interesting information, it's not going to be of any value to you. To use these tools, you really have to use them a lot, and you have to work with them until you understand them, until you discern how these things are identified. But if we look, for instance, at a servant city many times, because the servant gift tends to be victimized the most easiest of all the gifts, within a servant community, you will see there will either be immensely big exploitive businesses or a lot of small little service type of industries, mom and pop businesses in that community. You get those two variances within a servant community. So that might, for instance, that business aspect gives us then an indication of the service gift, of the servant gift, if we look at that disparity. So again, we're not giving you all the information on all the gifts and what type of businesses you'll be looking at, but that's one of the indicators of what gift you will be working with. Are you still with me? Okay, next, let's quickly go through each one of the 7 redemptive gifts to look at the most typical character traits that they have. That sort of helps you to identify the package. And we're going to go through all 7 very quickly. A lot of information. You've got everything written in front of you, so you can go back to that. And I would really suggest that you try and start making use of these tools, because I believe it will save us a lot of time and effort if we do so. If we look at the prophet cities, they've got the following characteristics normally. They have a profound resistance to bondage and being told what to do. Okay? They will resist anybody that tries to lord over them. That will be typical in the history of a prophet city. If you look at, for instance, America as a prophet nation, you look at Germany as a prophet nation, you look at Afghanistan as a prophet nation, they will not allow that type of thing. They will resist it. You look for bitterness. Bitterness is one of those things that the prophets need to wrestle with. And a good example is if you look at elections within that type of community, normally it's hotly contested, or you'll find a stalemate between groups because of things that happened in the past. Bitterness because of very contentious things in the past, and that bitterness stays within the community, is always visible, is always part of that setting, even in the politics. We look for a schizophrenic package of extreme discrimination, while at the same time there's a profound desire to help the poor. Again, a good example for me is America. You know, America, if you think of its history, where they stood up for the rights of people, and yet at the same page they had this immense slavery going. So there's this paradox of fighting for the rights of the weak or whatever, but at the same time you are oppressing them many times. So that's many times an indication. You look for excellence. The prophetic gift is always producing excellence. Within prophet communities, you'll find a high investment into infrastructure. Okay? And it's an ideological seedbed where ideas are birthed and flourish. Ideas are birthed and flourish. Because the prophet gift is ideologically driven. Okay? Then there will be radicalism that will flourish many times within that type of setting. I'm not sure, but if I think of the city of Lyon in France, and I've not studied it a lot, we haven't visited much, but for instance, Lyon was the center place for the resistance movement in the Second World War. If you think of that first thing where it says resisting bondage, you look at the fact radicalism. If I look at that city and I see that history part, my first question is, isn't this maybe a prophet city? Because that's typical of the prophet gift. It can be confused with the gift of teaching community because of the proliferation of colleges and universities, and yet a closer look indicates a difference because there's a birthing of new ideas in the educational institutions. There's also many times a profound capacity to communicate. Communication is high on the priority list. Again, if I think of the city of Lyon, they've got a massive, massive communication tower right in the middle of the city, which might be an indication of that. Okay, and third thing we look at is, no, that's not that one. They are also normally quick to take initiative in conflict, even intruding where nobody has asked them. America is a very good example of that. Okay, because they've got the prophet gift. When hope has been taken away, the future is stripped away from them, there is a depth of despair that is immense. I already said it's an ideologically driven community. You've got high levels of autonomy and rebelling against those that lord over them. You many times see creativity and the capacity to adapt, because the prophet gift is the gift that God has called to provide new paradigms, new technologies, research and development, things that other people haven't thought of before. And then they always have a pride in their military strength. Again, America is very well seen in their gift as a prophet. Okay, I know it's a nation. Okay, next we go to the servant city or town. Firstly, there's no fame for the community that's got the servant gift. In our modern day setting, we don't look up to people that have the servant gift. We look up to the leaders and those that have these strong personalities. So if you think, for instance, of India, who's got the redemptive gift of servant, nobody thinks very highly of that nation. And it's as if they have a lower image than what's real in India. People see them as much lower or less than what they really are. And that's very many times an indication of the servant gift. In fact, there's mostly overt dishonor, and that community is the object of endless jokes that are dishonoring and not realistically true. The reputation is consistently far below the reality of who they are. It's a city that attracts a disproportionate number of predators and victims of every sort. Okay, and predators are businessmen normally that are unashamedly exploiting their workers and so forth through the practices. So many times that might be an indication of a servant city. You will find an extraordinarily high amount of victimizations even within family. So statistics will show you that abuse, molestation, any form of victimization, hitting your wife, whatever, family violence would be much higher in those type of communities because of this victimization that comes so easily. These cities seem to attract those who have been wounded also in other cities, so they sometimes form a place of refuge for victims from other places to find refuge there. The demonic stronghold over the city centers around that victimization, and typically the city is primarily involved in agriculture or service industry. So the type of businesses that you'll see there will be normally around those two aspects. Within the structure of the city, there's a major problem with leadership. It only functions well when there's a strong leader, and yet historically leadership tend to be exploitive. So again, you get those two paradoxes. The final consistent characteristic of a servant city is that they are never offensively disruptive. That's why there's a lot of victimization, because they're not resisting it. Okay, so they won't be a community that resists or would disrupt back into that type of setting. Something that Arthur mentioned when he was here in August was he thinks that Durban might be a servant city. And one thing that he has experienced within servant cities is that when he gets there, he always sees a great capacity for joy amongst the people of a servant city. So I just want to mention that. Okay, then we go to the teaching city or the teacher city. Again, we already said we looked at the hospitals. Healing is a core component of the teaching DNA. And many times, not just that there is a lot of hospitals, but there's many times a lot of research in the medical field within such a community. These cities normally have fine cuisine. I wouldn't say Pretoria specifically displays that, but if we think of certain parts of Cape Town, Stellenbosch, for instance, as a redemptive gift of teacher, you get good cuisine there, and that's normally a sign of this. Now remember, the fact that there's a characteristic does not mean another gift cannot have that characteristic. You need to find the package. Okay, you look at the map, another simple indicator is the amount of parks. The teacher city is going to have more open space than the average city, other cities that you find. Okay, now don't just think of perfect parks, just think of green space and that type of thing. We were in the city of Rennes in France last year and the year before that. And I was astounded. We took this information and we found out that Rennes is definitely a teacher city. And one of the things that you see there is the immense amount of parks and green spaces that people have. Okay, you see a big focus on the past. History is important to a teacher community. A lot of museums, that type of thing, where you can learn about the history, where there's a focus on the history, the street names, all the places that's connected to history will be very clear. You look for schools, again, disproportionate number of schools, speciality schools, colleges, universities. The quality of education will be above average to other communities. So look at the matric pass rate. Go and see if your community has a greater average, and it seems there's greater quality of education than maybe the average, and that might be an indication. If I think of Pretoria, we really have prestige schools in the city. The city is known for those schools and their academic success. Okay, we look for transportation. Unusual to find a teacher city not having multiple major arteries in and out. Again, now you have to measure. How do you measure whether it's a lot or not? Okay, it's a process of, go and compare it to another city. I think if I have to compare Pretoria, for instance, with Joburg, and Joburg is really bigger than Pretoria. Pretoria has more highways coming into the city. Joburg has a ring road, but it's basically one highway coming through. Well, you go and have a look. It's difficult to measure it. If we went to the city of Rennes, we were astounded. Rennes was really in a position of a lot of crossroads. And the highway around Rennes, the highways going into the city was quite astounding. So that might be an indication of a teacher city. We're going to find a strong religious spirit. If you think of Pretoria, religious spirit is a very good explanation. People will always tell you Pretoria is so conservative. You know, the artists will always complain. And that's part of their religious spirit. So you're going to have a lot of churches, many times a lot of division amongst churches, because in the teacher city it's all about your theology. We can't mix with those people because their theology is questionable, so we tend to do our own thing because of that. There will be an independent spirit too in the churches that will tend to be divisive because of the theology thing. A surprising component in teacher cities is you will find a passive presence of war machinery, but it's normally passive, not active. Okay, we think of the forts in Pretoria. I wonder where there's one fort in Pretoria where they ever shot from. It was built, but it wasn't really used. Okay, the teacher community many times is a place of refuge, a safe place. So you'll see people come there and they'll tell you that we're comfortable here, we feel safe here, we don't feel like other communities where we feel in danger. The gift of teaching city develops prototypes. Again, a bit different to the prophet, where it's new technologies, new ideologies. They do not necessarily produce and market these things, but they do birth new ideas. There's an inherent in the DNA of the teacher city a death spirit. Okay, so many teacher cities you see, for instance, there's different ways, and we can't go through all the details, but a lot of teacher cities you'll get a big Freemasonry component that brings a death spirit, for instance, because it's got to do with that DNA that the enemy is trying to counter. Okay, if you look at the exhorter city, the exhorter community has characteristics from the giver and the ruler, which we'll later see, for instance, is great diversity. But both the giver and the ruler have a huge amount of diversity, particularly of cultures being brought in. But in the exhorter community, you will see that those groups, though they are different, they will never amalgamate. They will always keep their sort of own identities within that type of setting, which is quite interesting. Both the exhorter and the ruler have what we call an empire expansionist component to their DNA. They want to build an empire. If you think of colonial nations like France was a big colonial nation. As an exhorter, they had that expansionism DNA, just as the ruler has. England, a ruler, also a big colonial entity. Okay? The exhorter, because of its diversity, seemed to have something of everything that one of the other gifts have, except the fact that they are never low profile. Remember, the exhorter loves the spotlight. Okay, love activity and people, and so when you look at the cities, you will see that there's no. That's one thing, that's for sure. There's no low profile, and Arthur has told us that most of Cape Town is an exhorter gift. If you think of Cape Town, it's not low profile. Okay? The normalization and standardization of sin, particularly of sensuality, would be very evident. So entertainment and the focus on self will be evident. Frequently, there's a major commercial component to it, especially retail. And I just see that so much in France when we're there. I'm always astounded. The young people are in the shops. It's just shopping avenues wherever you go. And it's interesting that goes with the exhorter gift. The exhorter gift has the ability to receive conflicting groups of people, making room for them and keep them from amalgamating. So I think, is it Los Angeles that has Chinatown, and you've got all the different groups. They've got their own sector in town. That's very typical of your exhorter gift. That's why I think Paris is also an exhorter gift. You get your Chinese and you get your Muslims and your Moroccans and your Algerians. They're all sort of in a certain area. In the modern city, you see centralized city planning, restrictive building codes, and high degrees of state-level control. Okay. Let's move on to the giver. With the giver, you will first of all find that it's a very independent community. They solve their own problems and they're not looking for help from the outside. Interestingly, Afrikaner is a giver nation, or giver group of people, and South Africa is a giver nation. Okay, Israel is also a giver nation. You can think they're not independent, they're not dependent on others. They do their own thing and get it done. There's a religious spirit, a proliferation of religious activity, but the problem is there's a tendency of activity, more activity, less of spiritual life. The whole, going through the motions, doing the religious thing without really being spiritual. Okay, so the form of godliness, but lacking the power thereof. That's very typical. If you think of the Afrikaner, they're a religious people. They might not serve God, but there's a religious component. Okay, there's an immense diversity on every front, and South Africa is a very good example of that. Diversity of politics, religion, economics, history, races. It's just a lot of differentiation. There's also a diversity of churches in the city, each one standing alone. Great diversity in the expressions of faith, specifically the number of Protestant denominations. Again, in this instance, where you, for instance, have a lot of different ones, it's because they're independent that they do not necessarily work together. Okay, there's a diversity of food within giver communities. There also tends to be a definite high-profile entertainment industry, they find. Okay, this food is different. It's not fine cuisine. It's just a great diversity. Okay? So if you can think in South Africa, you can buy food of just about any nation because they live here. Okay. There's a birthing anointing for the redemptive gift of giving. So new industries, ministries, and organizations are birthed and go from there out to the rest of the land. This is a bit of a different thing than, for instance, the teacher and the prophet, in that the gift of giving is the best entrepreneurial gift. They're very good at seeing hidden options and niches that other people miss. Okay, and if you think of the Afrikaner as a giver, there's a pioneering facet in their DNA which comes from this birthing anointing. Okay, and the gift of giving anointing is something is developed or produced there that goes out, that helps other people to do what they need to do. So it's always something that has value outside of where they are. Okay, I believe the city of Angoulême in France is, for instance, a gift of giving city because God showed us, for instance, paper was made there and then exported to the rest of the country so that people had paper to write on. Buskruit, what is that? Gunpowder was made there and again was then taken into the rest of the country so they can do their warfare. So there's things like that within the gift of giving, something that they produce. Silicon Valley, for instance, has the gift of giving, and they produce the computer chip. And that thing goes out that enables other people to do what they need to do. And I really believe we would be sinning as a nation because of our gift if we do not help a country like Zimbabwe. Because our purpose and our call as a gift of giving gift is to go out and empower and give life and birth. So it would be wrong. People say, we are investing in that country and it's wrong. But if you look at the redemptive gift, I believe it will be sin if we don't do it because it's part of our gift. Remember, the gift of giving gift is also a generational gift that can have a lot of impact generationally. There's a high focus on safety, especially like in fire and police departments. Again, I'm pulling you the whole time to a nation gift because I don't have so many examples in the city format. I'm still studying this. But if you think, for instance, in the apartheid years, what great focus the government had on security. I mean, our army, our police, we were a police state in some ways, and we did it very well as givers because that's something the giver is very sensitive to. You think of Israel also, that's always their focus with good reason, not just because of their gift. Okay, well, you will find businesses that are more opportunistic than militantly aggressive because what you will find, for instance, with the prophets, they will just confront a thing and, work their way through it. The giver will negotiate. Tend to have a complex politics. There's such a need for control on every level. Even with that control, there's a desire to be non-confrontational as much as possible, to work through finesse. The gift of giving provides vital resources to communities outside of them, so that I just shared also. Let's go to the ruler city. Again, obviously the rulers, we call the rulers the empire builders, okay? And they've got a big empire building component. But that's not the only thing we'll look at. We also look for endurance and resurgence. If you think of the nation of Egypt, it's got the redemptive gift of ruling also. The endurance, resurgence, empire. As I said, England is also a ruling city. Washington, D.C. in America would be a ruling city. There's a lot of exploitation many times in the history of such a city. The masses are generally exploited for the sake of a ruling class. You'll also see an obsession with expansionism and empire building. Typically, you find governmental presence in cities that have the gift of ruling, but not every ruler city has a government seat, but there's a high correlation. Again, that can be misleading, but that might be an indication of a ruling gift. And that means any type of ruling. It doesn't have to be the seat of the nation. It can just be a seat of the county or a seat of a province or things like that. In the political scene, the gift of ruling tends to be very politically adept, able to outmaneuver others. You think of the English, the way they do politics. You know the joke about what it means to be a diplomat? If a diplomat says yes, he means maybe. If he says maybe, he means no. And if he says no, he's no diplomat. Okay, if we look at the ruler further, there's a healthy independent spirit, no welfare spirit, not looking for validation or verification from others. You think of China. They do what they want, and doesn't matter who's jumping up and down about it. They don't need their validation or verification. They're independent. They're doing what they want to do. Lastly, we go to the mercy city. And what you'll typically find within the mercy city, firstly, it will be a city of refuge. Refuge, not refuse. Okay, especially for those that have been rejected. Again, now we see that's also a form of victimization, people that will go there, but it's about rejection. Okay, the core value within mercy cities or towns would be tolerance. If you think of the tribe of Benjamin in the Old Testament, they had the redemptive gift of mercy. You remember the story of the man that went and he raped, I think, a guy from Judah's wife, and then he killed her. And then that man was obviously not very happy. And so he cut his wife up into small little pieces and sent her body all around the whole of Israel to say, look what they've done to my wife. And when Israel went to the Benjamites and said, give us that man, that we can kill him, they said no. Interesting, if you look at the redemptive gift of mercy in the individual, there's a funny streak that comes forth. There's a stubbornness sometimes. And in this instance, when we look at mercy cities, there's a tolerance, especially for sin many times. And the worst thing you can be is to not tolerate other people. The ability to tolerate diversity and different views. They are willing to tolerate everything except intolerance. Okay, if we think of San Francisco, it's a mercy city. Okay, and they say it's quite astounding. I mean, everything goes. They tolerate everything. The homosexuals, the Satanists, everything. Everybody must be loved, and we must just tolerate them. That's very typical of the mercy gift. Okay, relatively high levels of immorality and sexual perversion will also be found in this type of communities. Because when you look at the mercy gift is all about fulfillment. The mercy gift was made by God to experience fulfillment in every facet. And you'll see that manifest, whether it's in the arts or the architecture or whatever expression that city has. But because of that, sexual immorality is obviously a place where people go. There's also a diversity of worship. I haven't mentioned this at the teacher gift. At the teacher gift, you will find many times also a lot of different forms of worship being expressed, especially occultic forms. But in the Mercy City, you'll also find the diversity of worship, and there's a much broader cross-section of worship other than Judeo-Christian worship. You are going to find every cult and ism represented there. Again, because it's rooted in that thing of trying to find fulfillment. And so they're searching in whatever spiritual avenue they can find. You will find a drive toward creativity and a drive to self-expression. Whether in the stores, the boutiques, the restaurants, the architecture, and so forth. I always say about the redemptive gift mercies individuals, I say they suck the juice out of life. Mercies I know will just go gaga about a flower. I'll look at it and say, it's just a flower. Okay, so you'll find that within that city also, that expression towards creativity. There's a tendency to not want to reject, but to tolerate any group, allowing the rejection to come and express, allowing the rejected to come and express their views. They tolerate and accept those who are rejected and repudiated elsewhere. Again, I think San Francisco is a good example. They were the first city that married the homosexuals because these poor people are rejected in other places. They can't do it. Come here, you're welcome. We will help you. Okay, that's the mercy gift. Even the church is tolerated as long as they do not preach intolerance. Okay, so that was the second step, is basically go through the characteristics of your city and try to figure out which gift you're working with. Now, for me, I'm very slow in identifying things. I have to weigh it for a long time. Normally, it's quite easy to get it down to 2 or 3. Okay, that's definitely not one of these 4. Okay, it's between 1, 2, or 3, and then it takes time getting to know your city, looking at research, and trying to understand the underlying things to get to the gift that your city has. So after you've identified the city, the next thing that you need to do is you need to identify the principle of the gift. Every gift has an underlying principle, the thing to which God has called it, the thing that it's supposed to live out. For the prophet, it's the principle of design. Now, I can't explain all these things for you in this lecture. You'll just have to go and study it more if you want to find out. You can get the CD sets. The servant is about the principle of authority. The teacher, the principles of responsibility. The exhorter, the principles of reality. The giver, the principles of stewardship. And the ruler, principles of freedom. And then the mercy, the principles of fulfillment. That principle is paramount. You really need to understand what that principle is about if your city have that gift, because that's what you are aiming at, to bring it forth in the godliness that God wants it. The fourth step will be to identify the stronghold over the city. So now that I know what the gift of the city is, I immediately know the strongholds, because they would be opposite of that gift. Now you will see further in your notes, I've given you really 2 sets of notes. Here is the main stronghold that will be identified, but if you look at each one of those cities, there's 2 or 3 things that fall under that stronghold that's normally visible, that we need to see and then deal with. Remember, the stronghold is only there because of the sin. So with the prophet community, you will see fractured relationships will be your stronghold. The servant community, the victim spirit. The teacher community, the religious spirit. The exhorter community, the cult of comfort. The giver community, ownership. The ruler, a predator spirit. And the mercy, a stronghold of self-gratification. So that would be the demonic thing that's visible, which you can see is the opposite of what God has meant that city to bring forth. Then step 5 will then be to identify the root iniquity connected to that stronghold, or giving place for that stronghold to develop. If we have to reduce them to a one-liner, it will be as follows. The prophet has a focus on the rights of individuals. The servant is willing to have peace at any cost. Doesn't matter how much they get victimized. The teacher has a problem with selective responsibility. So within teaching communities, you'll find churches, for instance, God has told us to do a lot of things for the kingdom. We are supposed to look after the poor. We're supposed to be the light into our communities. But in the teacher community, we just do more spiritual things. Let's do more teaching. Let's do more worship. Let's do more all spiritual things. And then we ignore this part that we're not doing. Okay, and that's where the selective responsibility causes the stronghold of a religious spirit, because we do the religious thing without doing the godly thing of impacting and taking responsibility for the other things. If you look at the exhorter iniquity, it is denial. Yes. The giver is the spirit of control. For the givers, it's so difficult to let go of control. And if we keep controlling, and the stronghold becomes ownership, it's mine, I want to control it, and so forth. The rule is exploitation, and the mercy is stubbornness. What is the essential virtue that needs to be developed in order to counter that iniquity? And this is very important for us as intercessors, because that's what we will have to develop as intercessors in order to pray about the issue in the city. Many pastors go and visit another town and minister there, and they find, wow, things are moving and demons are screaming and whatever. They see results that they don't see when they minister in their own church at home. And then I think it's because their church isn't as holy, but it's not that. Is the pastor has authority over certain things, but the community that he's in, he doesn't have the authority for the issue that's in that community. But when he goes to another community that has an issue for which he has already developed authority, there's results. Okay, so it's about correlating your development of authority to the thing that you need to address within the city. And it just makes so much sense that we take responsibility in that manner as intercessors to develop it in our own lives before we expect to pray it into our communities. So the essential virtues, the principle that we need is, for the prophet, is being a rebuilder, especially in relationships. For the servant, it's walking in dominion, because that's the opposite of victimization. The teacher is to sanctify his own family, because that is taking responsibility. You're not selective in your responsibility. Most teachers do very well at their work, but the family and the household and those things are sort of left behind. The exhorter is embracing the pain. The giver is walking by faith. That's the opposite of control, letting go. The ruler being life-giving. That's the opposite of being a predator, just sucking life out of people. The mercy to please God, not please people. Okay, and then step 7 is to look at the catalytic institution. Once you've developed the right virtue, you are ready to move towards the specific action in the city. It is recommended that you work with the catalytic institution in the community, the place where life first flowed in that community. So for instance, if we look at the city of Pretoria, we are sort of in two minds about Pretoria, because Pretoria was started because of governmental leaders that said, listen, this thing of 3 different cities where we have the Senate meeting every 3rd year is not working, because if we're in Lydenburg, then all the people from that town pushes the vote into their direction. If we are in Rustenburg, they do the same. If we're in Potch, they do the same. So let's get a central place where that we can do so that we fix that problem. And then they were very clever. They said, but how are we going to get people to recognize a place like that as a capital, as a place to come together? Says, why don't we put up a church? And then let's get everybody together there for communion every 3 months or so. And then when everybody is there, they're together anyway, and we can start with the governmental things, making decisions. So it seems to me that Pretoria has a bit of a dilemma in that the church and governmental has sort of a catalytic position. To me, it seems that the church was more catalytic to the government, so that the government was catalytic to the establishment of Pretoria. But I think we can talk about that and try to figure that out. But that means that's what we need to be focusing on as a catalytic institution, to see the city impacted in a greater manner. Then we want to later on, once we've gone through all those processes, get to understand what the birthright of the city is. Now, the birthright of every city will be very unique, because it's the call, it's the thing that city needs to accomplish, that God has created that city for, and if it does not accomplish that, it's missing God's perfect will. And that obviously we cannot figure out with a bit of information and research and mapping. This is a process where God will need to reveal it at His time, but He cannot release the birthright if we do not have the structures ready to hold the ground, spiritually speaking. That brings us to issues of curses and blessings, because curses obviously prevent us from experiencing the best that God has for us, and blessings obviously is what we want to see come forth in our community so that God's kingdom can be experienced. And there are 7 forms of curses that are connected to the 7 redemptive gifts. There's also a whole teaching series on that. I'm just going to mention it quickly. So we look at our city and we ask ourselves, do we have the following curse in this community? Firstly, the Aramean curse, meaning we cannot get justice. Okay, so the servant, the Moabite curse, cannot get started. The Philistine curse for the teacher, the lack of the key resource. The Canaanite curse for the exhorter, an incredible oppressive workload. For the Midianite curse for the giver, seasonal devouring of money and family relationships. The Jotham curse for the ruler, perpetual betrayal from within. And for the mercy, it's the Ammonite curse, barrenness and lack of fruitfulness. So we're trying to gauge if we have any one of those 7 curses functioning within our community, because we want to deal with it and remove it. Remember, you can have more than just one of those curses. If we look, for instance, at Israel, we see that Israel has the Aramean curse that's connected to the prophet most times because they cannot get justice in the international community. Okay, so that's just an interesting point. And then the good news is that there are 7 blessings that we want to establish. And Arthur then believes that when we are praying within a community, we need to establish them in order from number 1 until we get to number 7. There's good reasons therefore. So once you get into the positive aspects in your city, when you want to establish these blessings, you start with number 1. So does our city have favor? If it doesn't have favor, or what level of favor does it have within the country or the communities around it? And then getting strategies from God, how we can lift that blessing to a greater measure. For the servant, the servant aspect is to secure your borders. The teacher, supernatural strategies. The exhorter facet, time to develop finest abilities. Time to develop it. Remember, the curse was oppressive workload. You don't have time to develop the right things. Now the blessing is you've got time to develop your finest abilities. Being able to accrue financial and relational capital for the giver facet. Building synergistical life-giving institution is the ruler portion. And then the mercy portion is possessing the birthright. And then we would have accomplished the full calling that God has for that community. Okay? Therefore, we walk through these 7. We see where the glass ceiling is, and we ask God for strategy and the appropriate process, how we can lift that. That's basically it. I'm going to finish there. There's a lot of information in your notes, but as I say, the teaching material is available. It's a lot of material to work through, but I really believe we have tools here that can immensely help every intercessor to be productive and to have a process to get to the end product that we believe God has meant for that city. Thank you.